Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. I did a video a few months ago where I finally listened to the first ever Beatles album, Please Please Me, and now I'm going to listen to the second ever Beatles album called With the Beatles. Now, I've been getting these nice physical copies of various classic albums from the library, and I love doing that. I love just thinking of an album as something you have to find and then looking through the insert. Now, unfortunately, with these library copies, some patrons aren't the best at taking care of their materials, so this is how it arrived. Can't really blame them for the smashed jewel case, especially right now you have to return them in slots, but there's no insert. It's disappeared. We do at least have this beautiful disc, and we have the back, but part of the album experience was missing for me. But anyway, let's react to some of these tracks. So the first track on this album is called It Won't Be Long, and I found this one very memorable. It starts just with these very intense yeahs, and also just makes good use of backing vocals. And I guess it's just incredible how catchy so many of these early Beatles songs were. So I wasn't familiar with It Won't Be Long before this, and I can believe that because, this one sounded a lot to me like a hit. Now, for people who are slightly older than me, or for people whose parents introduced them to the Beatles through individual albums or made sure they heard every single Beatles song, maybe this one does count as one of the old classic hits, but for me it's not one of the famous ones, and it just shows the depth of the Beatles catalog. The next song is called All I've Gotta Do, and I had a similar reaction to It Won't Be Long. It sounded like it certainly had hit potential. It made use of a lot of sustained notes, and it's John in the lead vocals. Now, John doesn't have the strongest singing voice out there. It's pretty good. It's more than good enough. But I remember reading in Philip Norman's biography of John Lennon that I believe it would have been George Martin who described Paul McCartney as olive oil and John Lennon as lemon. Now, lemon can be a nice part of cooking, but it is kind of sour. It's not as straightforwardly delicious as olive oil is. But oftentimes in music, when something is slightly off, but everything else is well done, it just sounds kind of interesting. So even though John's voice isn't quite right for the sustained notes, it actually gives them a kind of interesting feel. It's more interesting to hear those notes sustained by lemon juice than by olive oil. There's also a nice use of drums on Ringo's part. It's kind of like when the drums come in, they're dropping the bass, though I guess they're dropping the drums, they're not dropping the bass. People say that. And then there are these, again, slightly awkward sounding lone cymbals, but a controlled awkwardness is a good awkwardness. It makes the music more interesting. Track 3, we finally get to something that I think of as one of the Beatles' all-time hits, All My Loving. And I think this song is so memorable because there's nothing fancy about it. The lyrics are certainly fairly simple. The chords aren't anything too hard to play, but it's a distinct sound. It doesn't quite sound like any of the standardized pop songs of its time. The other notable thing about it is just that very fast up and down guitar strum pattern. I've tried to play this song on guitar the way it sounds on the record, and it just kills my wrists. So I end up not duplicating that diddle 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 sound and just go da 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 da. Anyway, it's a fun song to play, but it's better to listen to the Beatles do it. Next, you get to Don't Bother Me, which I believe is George Harrison's first original song included on a Beatles album. It has a vaguely minor sound to it, though not too serious in its brutishness. There's also a reasonable amount of vibrato on the vocals. It reminds me of some of the early Neil Diamond songs, which would have come a few years after this. But if you think of songs like Solitary Man or Love to Love, or You'll Forget, that vague broodingness with a bit of echo, it's a kind of unique sound that doesn't always lend itself to hits, but it's not too far off. The next song on the album is called Little Child. It opens up with harmonica, and it's catchy. It's maybe not as strong as the first few songs on the album. It comes across more as this sort of crossing point of rock pop and nursery rhyme. It's just sort of supposed to have this overall fun sound without necessarily investing you too much in the lead vocalist. Next on the album comes Till There Was You. I knew before that the Beatles sung this one, and I think it's really cool that they do because it's from a musical called The Music Man, which is the first musical I ever saw, unless you count animated Disney movies or other children's movies with singing in it. And The Music Man is the story of this con man who comes to a small town in Iowa, and this smart librarian, sort of feminist figure named Marion, who is the only one in town who sees through his ruse and tries to stop him. But then over the course of the play, she realizes that other than the fact that he's into swindling, he might be one of the nicest guys in town, and she ends up falling in love with him. So Till There Was You is this very powerful song where Marion, who's the consciousness and the brains of the whole show, decides to tell Harold Hill, you're not the villain, you're the hero of this story. So my one critique of this song is it's not sung with that kind of emotional weight. It's just Paul McCartney singing what I imagine he thought was a beautiful song, and it has this kind of French cafe sound. There's a hand drum, there's little runs on an acoustic guitar. Next on the album comes Please Mr. Postman. I think it's interesting that you have this non-original song sung by Paul and this non-original song sung by John, and they both have a very different feel to them. Please Mr. Postman is a Motown song, and I feel like John's lemon juice voice works really well on it. It adds kick to the yearning in this song. I also find the lyrics surprisingly interesting, even if they're not deep. Eventually goes, wait a minute, and that's just so effective because a postman is never someone who would wait, never someone who would even bother to interact or think deeply about their letters. I'm not saying they can't, it's just generally the job is of the postman is not to interact with people, it's just to walk house to house, put the letters in the mailbox, and go away. So there's just something powerful about this image of pleading to the postman, this intermediary, to be engaged. Next on the album comes Roll Over Beethoven. It's a Chuck Berry song, and the Chuck Berry version is a real anthem of rock and roll because it's saying, hey, move over classical music. We have this new fun music. It may not be as fancy, but it's the fun tune in town, and we're proud of ourselves. We're going to enjoy it. The Beatles, I feel like they're paying tribute to this being foundational rock and roll, to rock at its foundations being a very simple sound. And when the guitar first comes in, it sounds even thinner than on the original Chuck Berry recording. And I love the passion of John's voice on this one. I feel like Chuck Berry has a very friendly sound to his voice. He's like, hey, roll over Beethoven, whereas John's more intense. He's really saying, roll over Beethoven. Next on the album comes Hold Me Tight, and this kind of continues the rootsy sound. The instrumentation is kind of simple. Again, this idea of things being slightly awkward but contained. It opens with this line, it feels so right. It's not a natural place to open the song, but the rest of the song is just so well put together that works. I also find it interesting that when John and Paul do the higher vocal harmonizations together, they don't quite do that standard Beatles falsetto, the ooh. They manage to keep it, I believe, in the sort of standard diaphragm voice. They're not going cartoonishly high, but you can tell they're consciously choosing not to do that. They're going high within their regular voices, and that just sounded interesting to me. Next on the album comes You Really Got a Hold on Me. This is a song originally by Smokey Robinson, and it's a very familiar standard for me. So I didn't experience it as fresh in the way I was experiencing the songs I hadn't heard before. I found it interesting that this one happens to be a John Lennon, George Harrison duet. The Beatles are clearly trying to develop George as a vocalist. At this point, John is the stronger vocalist, and I know I've been seemingly putting his voice down by making the lemon juice point, but the lemon juice point doesn't necessarily have to be a put down. And again, John still has a very strong voice with a reasonable range. You can hear that he's a bit stronger than George, especially when it comes to the falsetto. But for me, John and George have very similar voices, and George would go on to have a very impressive singing voice in his solo career. So it's just interesting to hear them contrasted against one another. I also wondered, why it's not John and Paul here, and I wonder if it's almost like, well, if it's John and Paul, are people gonna think there's like a romantic relationship between them, which would have been controversial back then, whereas with John and George, it's just two people singing the song. There's not necessarily any assumed intimacy there. Next on the album comes I Wanna Be Your Man. It's Ringo singing this one, though it took me a while to realize that, other than I did notice it was a kind of deeper voice, and when there's a deeper sound, I tend to think of it as Ringo and Paul. But I think there's a kind of uncanny thing to the recording here. So maybe they didn't fully trust Ringo as a singer, so even though his voice is the loudest in the mix, the other voices are mixed in well, so it doesn't quite sound like a group singing, and it doesn't sound like one man singing. It's really uncanny. And on top of it, there's this sort of forest of drums sound to, how fast Ringo is beating his percussive contribution to the track. And then there are also these little sounds in there that are they're kind of psychedelic. I don't know if it's just guitar, whether they had any sort of synthesizer technology at this point, but even if the Beatles weren't consciously doing experimental material at this point, I can hear the beginning of psychedelic music, and I Want to Be Your Man if you listen to it the right way. So next on the album is a song called Devil in Her Heart. It's by a guy called Richard Drapkin. He had originally recorded the song himself under the name Ricky D, and George Harrison is the lead vocal on this one. This song, nothing about it really stood out to me. I think the Beatles have sort of done what they're going to do with this album for the most part, and it just sort of mixes the motifs of the other songs. So you hear a bit of that Parisian cafe guitar from Till There Was You. It also has that Motown feel we've heard on several of the covers so far, though it also gets Britishized and Beatleized a bit by when Harrison overpronounces the title of the song, Devil in Her Heart. The next song on the album, Not a Second Time, again, I had a similar reaction. I felt like, okay, I've heard the album up to this point. It's a good song, not too much more for me to say, other than the bassy sounds, which I believe are both coming from the low notes on a piano and an actual bass guitar really stand out. I looked this one up on Wikipedia, and what they say about it is music analysts have focused on the alien cadence. The quick version of that I got because I'm not a musicologist. I don't really know what it means. But it's jumping not to G, which is the sort of the bass note for the song, but to E minor, which is the relative minor, which is, I guess, the cousin of G. And so it's this awkward dissonance because to the Western or standard global musical ear, minor sounds sad, whereas major sounds happy. John Lennon said this wasn't intentional. He, like me, not a musicologist. When he heard Aeolian cadence, he said, oh, that just sounds like a pretty kind of bird or something. Not a Second Time, it does have that sort of bassy, angry edge under it, and that element really comes out in the final song on the album, Money. Now, this, again, this is a cover of what I believe would have been a Motown song. I've heard this one before, but I probably heard live versions, and I might have only heard like Beatles cover bands do it or something, because it really stood out to me how much bass you hear and just how much anger is in John Lennon's voice. Money is a very simple pop song, and so on. I'm, a young person who wants some money to spend. I don't really have values. I just want to be rich. I just want to spend money, man. But John really puts this angry spin on it with his lemon juice voice. And there's a bit of contrast between the sort of standard poppy backup vocals you're hearing from Paul and George and John's really passionate, angry voice. And I wonder if this is the personality of the John Lennon who would come to be famous in his solo career starting to blossom. The other Beatles are happy for this just to be a pop song about, yeah, it's nice to be rich. It's nice to have spending money. Whereas John is saying, yeah, it's nice to be rich and I want that. And I'm greedy, and I know this greed in me is bad. I know there's this darkness in me, and I want to be angry at it, but I haven't quite come to terms at it. So he's beginning the primal screams that would define the more introspective later part of his career. But anyway, I think the Beatles came more into their own. They found more of their sound with the Beatles, and I guess we'll see with albums 3 and 4. But right now it feels like this real high point. If they found their commercial sound, it's not maybe the most interesting thing, but it's very successful. And again, I said, I Want to Be Your Man. It has this almost psychedelic feel to it. It's a lot of fun to listen to. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.